myself more with your work. I read
Mhm.
Fatka, which you mentioned last time, and I also got Everybody's Lying About Islam here with me.
Mhm.
And yeah, I'd be very interested in getting into the topic of power again, as this is a bit of the through line on my channel right now, focusing
Mhm.
on the topic of power. And
Mhm.
also, specifically, maybe is to tie it back to a concrete example, as it's also kind of very recent uh, in current times. The notion of Islam or power, how it is expressed in the Middle East currently. Um, I think that'd be a good thing to get into, especially as due to my background, I familiarized myself more with those areas rather than like places like South America or Africa. I think you're
Mhm.
definitely I'd say in general you're more well versed in these areas, but I suppose I can contribute more when we speak about the Middle East, when we speak about Islam. Um,
I mean, honestly, I'm more well versed with the Middle East at this point, just because the amount of news that it has produced over the past decade as I've been putting up these videos. So I've unfortunately, I suppose it makes it an unhappy region that I've had the occasion to do deep dives on a number of countries. Whereas I think have growing familiarity with a lot of the other regions, but I feel like weirdly, despite how Anglo I am in my roots, I do feel that the Middle East is kind of an analytical home for me that I'm branching out from.
Okay, yeah, yeah. And speaking about your roots, you've mentioned before that you were originally an attorney. Is that right?
Yes, I was originally a number of things. I was a stockbroker for a minute. I was an attorney for probably all told about 5 or 6 years.
Okay,
I'm still technically an attorney according to the state of New York,
okay,
but I haven't attempted to practice in closing on a decade now. So.
okay. And then you, as I understood it, you gotten into history, which has
Hmm.
kind of brought you into what I found so particularly interesting about your work, into a kind of more post-ideological position. Because usually I see people commenting on these things, and I can immediately squarely put them in a camp, if you know what I mean.
Yeah,
And
it's a
I
little.
feel like it's not that straightforward with you. You are kind of coming from a more general historical perspective and don't kind of adhere or subscribe to necessarily one kind of narrative.
Well, I think it's sort of incredible remorse for being a very firm adherent to one of those camps in my youth.
Okay.
Sort of in my early days, I was very angry about 9/11. It was, one of my favorite lunch spaces had gotten evaporated, and
Okay.
my reaction was quite thuggish and quite frankly bigoted. So I was initially I was an Iraq War supporter, and I kind of feel like I've been making up for that mishap ever since. So I very quickly, not well, actually not quickly enough, but within 5 years or so, I figured out just how absolutely let's see what's a more pleasant, less profanity laced way to put this. Just how limiting the standard perspectives on these questions are.
Yeah, that's interesting. What at the time, and first of all, it's also commendable. I would say I don't think I know many people that would say that about their own ideological positions of the past, even if they have changed them. Right?
Mhm.
It's just kind of like, oh no, I've always been like this. So I do find that impressive and respectable. First of all,
Oh, thank you, thank you. I have always been arrogant and very confident in my views. That I can say has been a consistent through line. But I think I've realized, just watching the debacle that developed in Iraq, and then living in a Muslim country in Turkey for a number of years, just sort of realized like, oh wow, I got a lot of things really wrong. So.
yeah, yeah, and I what as I said earlier, the refreshing part about this is that it is kind of, you didn't kind of jump into the next ideological camp, but it's kind of become a bit more post ideological, a bit more. It has made it more objective, in my view. Like other than reading your books, I've also checked out your podcast. For all the viewers, I can definitely recommend. we where you spoke as well, for example, about Argentina, and you spoke about Milei and all that, and I didn't have the impression that you've just kind of went from libertarian to jumped over and became a leftist and are just, dogmatically bashing him or something like that. It was very measured. It was very kind of analytic in many regards.
It's funny. For lack of a better, I think I've kind of turned into like a New Deal Democrat. It's probably, I think sort of without the segregation, but sort of like sort of, probably closest to sort of a 1950s style Democrat who believes that actually there's probably a role for government, unlike all the things that I was taught and believed very fervently in my 20s. But I mean, all that said, like it's entirely, I could totally imagine that the pendulum keeps swinging. We go too far in the other direction, and 20 years from now, I'll be more libertarian again.
Right,
Just like I'm trying. It's an ongoing attempt to reckon with where we are.
right,
Where we are is I sort of belatedly realized it's like actually things have been pretty libertarian the sort
right.
of for quite a long time now, and the sort of standard approach for the official Libertarian Party is real libertarianism has never been tried, or what have you.
Just like with
Um,
communism, right?
it's the same bag.
Yeah, either
Um,
property is theft or taxes are theft.
So I'm just developing a lot more respect. Maybe this is a middle-aged thing for people who attempt to do good things in government, in business, deal with the frameworks that as we find them, rather than pretending. I think if you look honestly at the way the world has developed, and you arrive in your 40s and you still have a dogmatic approach, be it libertarian or leftist with a particularly prescribed program, you're just not very smart.
Right,
Um,
right.
my would be my read on it.
The world
Uh,
just doesn't function that way. It doesn't function according to some algorithmic principles of a certain ideology, right?
no, it does not. It does not. In
Right.
my experience, it does not.
Yeah, in that context, I always find it interesting to look at power in that context because, like I said, power is kind of the through line. In my most recent work on this channel, I'm going to be teaching a course on the philosophy of power. So I've familiarized myself with a lot of authors that have just written on power from different angles, whether it be like Foucault on a social level, social systems level, or whether it be people like de Jouvenel or Carl Schmitt on the topics of sovereignty and historical power. And what I notice as well in terms of ideologies, there's always different attributions of power depending on the ideology. If you look at libertarians, then the boogeyman is the state, it's the government, it's global socialism. Even after even post Soviet Union, right? It's still the socialists, global socialism, something like that, right? And if you look at it from another ideological lens, if you look at it from a more socialist or communist lens, then obviously power lies in capital. It lies in global capitalism or imperialism, and these sorts. And I'd be interested now, given that you've kind of gone past a purely ideological approach, how would you, if you were to be asked, understand or conceptualize power? What would be your like ad hoc explanation, definition you would give that is always accompanying your analyses?
Well, I don't have one, so but I'm happy to improvise. I would say that like power is everywhere. Leftist critiques of power, libertarian critiques of power, all have elements of real truth in them. And I think it's almost a dodge. It's almost in service to power to adopt a an adamant definition like no, 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 all the power that's bad is a government or no, 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 all the power that's bad is capital. It's interweaved and intermixed in ways. It's absurd in a modern country to pretend that government and corporate power are divisible in any real way. And I think the what bothers me more about both left and right critiques of power is not the identification, is not a lot of the points. Usually, if an activist, be they leftist or libertarian, like gets a particular bee in their bonnet and does research and decides that a certain agency or corporation is doing wrong, they're usually probably right in that like siloed that they probably surfaced something that's worth paying attention to.
Mm-hmm.
But what I object to is the demonization on both sides of power. I think that power is stupid, more broadly, more than I think it is evil.
Okay,
Uh,
okay. Hmm.
and I think that
But does it have a benign aspect?
well, yeah, power absolutely. I mean, you need power to get things done.
Right.
And I think power is everywhere is almost sort of a utopian way of looking at things. I do actually believe that within Europe, the United States, and a number of other political systems, you actually do have a lot of power lying around waiting to be picked up, whether it's through the ballot box or through various advocacy approaches, activism, what have you. And I think there's a great deal of cynicism about that. And I'm not saying that that cynicism is entirely wrong,
Hmm.
but I do think that falling into that cynicism, oh, the evil deep state or these evil capitalist, professional managerial class monsters, or like, it's just like the demonization and the sort of assumption that no change is possible, better things can't happen, is probably what I find more irritating than either left or right critiques of power at this point.
Right, right. And are you familiar with the documentaries of Adam Curtis?
Oh, I love Adam Curtis. He's great.
I was expecting that.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So it does remind me, some of these arguments does remind me of him, because he's also kind of a guy where you wouldn't be able to immediately pick what kind of ideology he's subscribing to. He's kind of addressing things from different angles. Everyone kind of gets their share of critique. And
Mhm.
you mentioned something as well just now about that the world has gotten very libertarian, even though they say it's not real libertarianism. Are you, just to clarify, are you referring to like post Reagan and Thatcher kind of deregulation
Yeah.
efforts, privatization?
Neoliberalism more broadly, yeah, for
Okay.
sure.
What I find interesting, that probably ties into your argument about like these two spheres interweaving, that you cannot separate government from economics, is that you actually, correct me if I'm wrong, you do still have a lot of regulation, only it tends to be more in favor of big business. Is that right?
Well, it's so much the way that regulation works and how it interacts with the current state of the legal profession, the current state of how people think this regulation should act. It's actually, it is in some ways akin to theology. If we were going to talk about Islam a little bit, which school of thought is applied to this massive body of um, uh, strictures as to how a life or an economy should be lived. One of the great dynamics with Lena Khan, who's probably my favorite Biden administration appointee, and many others as well. She's in charge of the Federal Trade Commission. And her big argument, she's basically single-handedly kind of shut down mergers and acquisitions in the United States. It's a huge, huge different shift. This is why you're seeing Goldman Sachs make big rounds of layoffs. This is why you're seeing McKinsey make big rounds of layoffs. It's because one 35-year-old or something along those lines managed to end up, as the head of the Federal Trade Commission, and is simply just not allowing monopolistic mergers to go forward. And it's this extraordinary shift. But the argument that she makes is actually all these laws are here. We're just enforcing the laws that were laid down in the 1890s and the 19 teens.
Mm-hmm.
What shifted with Reagan and Thatcher across a broad domain, but it's much more obvious and more easy to talk about with competition law, was a number of intellectuals managed to convince enough people at the Department of Justice and the Federal Trade Commission that actually we don't really need to enforce things this way. If we look at competition in a slightly different way that says, well,
Right,
really,
right.
as long as things are getting cheaper, it's fine.
Yeah, yeah,
Uh,
yeah, yeah.
and so really it is interesting and I guess maybe a libertarian critique to say that like the massive corpus of federal regulation in the United States is built up to this extent where you can kind of, if you're in power, make it mean whatever you want it to mean. And that's not true. Like there are like strict laws, but it just is in one dynamic of what happened with Reagan and the aftermath was like some of it is actual laws changing. Some of it is certain things just being defunded. So like maybe they're supposed to still be happening, but they just aren't because there isn't money there for them anymore. And some of
Yeah,
it was just changing legal interpretations, convincing more and more courts that certain regulations aren't that important, or certain laws can be interpreted in a different way.
yeah, yeah.
So
There's
perhaps it's
one
less.
argument that I hear from libertarians, which I don't have a counter to, or like maybe you know more about this, is that like the effective amount that we are taxed hasn't really been radically reduced, or is that false?
There's so many ways to play with those numbers.
Okay.
What is likely is that the effective amount that wealthy people are taxed at is dramatically lower. That
Oh,
was
okay.
something just this week. But maybe if you took as if the style of life and lifestyle in circa 2024 of the average American were at all comparable to the same situation for a 1970s average American, maybe you can say the median taxpayer isn't paying a particularly lower burden, possibly. But what really matters is the tax burden that corporations are paying. What really matters is the tax burden that people in the top 10% are paying.
Yeah.
And I can say with great confidence that those burdens are significantly lower. Um,
Okay, that's actually a good point. Yeah, yeah. So I'd like to, if that's fine with you, I'd like to move on to your book and your work
oh
on.
no, we have to talk about my writing? Oh.
Well, I'm not gonna comment on your writing.
Well, no, no, I'm saying like that was I'm perfect, always very happy to talk about my book.
Oh yeah, it
And
was
so,
just me not
yeah.
picking up on the joke. Okay, so I just straight up, just starting off with the title, you're saying everybody's lying about Islam. What is the
Mhm.
lie?
So it's interesting because it's I almost get nostalgic sometimes with certain bigoted comments in my YouTube channel because it just brings me back to 2015. This is very much written in the environment that produced Brexit actually. The environment in 2014, 2015, the Islamic State became a huge boogeyman, certainly in the United States and for some better reasons in Europe as well. And there was just this general upsurge in a really strong version of Islamophobia that had been percolating for a decade, 15 years, really, ever since 9/11, but really just full throttle 2014, 2015. And I think, honestly, kind of like the Trump fiasco may have helped to sort of clear some of that venom out of the body politic because we were just so busy attacking each other that we weren't fantasizing about evil Muslims anymore.
Right.
But a key part of Donald Trump getting elected was that strain of vicious Islamophobia. And I think one of the great rallying cries for Sean Hannity was like, Donald Trump is going to call it what it is, radical Islamic terrorism, or what
Mm.
have you. Like,
And
because the
he had that
lefties,
travel ban, right?
yeah, exactly. The lefties are too afraid to talk about it.
Hmm.
And I found that like you could sort of oppose the Republican version, or to actually different Republican versions. The George W. Bush approach, despite being a guy responsible for the death of a million Middle Easterners entirely at his own choice, was always very careful. while demonizing the entire religion to say, no, 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 Muslims are our friends. And he'd like go do a talk at a mosque and the other thing. Whereas with Trump, it was sort of the mask had fallen, and with a wide range of other Republican Party. But like the Democratic Party and Bush were sort of in this, oh, well, you have to think about the root causes of terrorism, and you have to understand that there's some issues here, and let's think about it more carefully as we surgically bomb all these people.
Right.
Whereas the Republicans sort of transitioned from Bush's, somewhat thinking there are good Muslims to like just straight out, what's wrong here? Everybody's evil approach. And I thought they were both kind of bullshit because the fundamental problem was 9/11, was terrorist attacks, was radical Islamic terrorism or what have you. And it's all about Saudi funding. It's essentially largely cooked up between the United States and a variety of mostly Saudi religious entrepreneurs, heavily funded by Saudi Arabia in the 1980s to use as a weapon against the Soviet Union. And that weapon boomeranged back at us. But it was just absolutely absurd in a context where, even sort of, nominally more left-leaning folks were making big waves like Bill Maher or Sam Harris for just being brave enough to speak the truth about Islam and the problem with this society. And it's just like the problem with this society is that starting off in the aftermath of World War II, the United States decided to set up the weakest possible entity in charge of the most oil, and that was Saudi Arabia. We correctly nominated that, and kept them in power. And part of their legitimation involved, honestly, a widespread act of cultural genocide across the Muslim world, replacing a very diverse and very bountiful cornucopia of differing approaches
A lot of
to Islam.
Bedouins and nomadic people and things like that. Yeah.
Well, and every, I mean, Egyptian, very rich tradition of Egyptian mixing of modernity and Islam and attempts to, diverse attempts to go at that. And sort of, I think there's a lot of attempts to divide Saudi influence from the Muslim Brotherhood in ways that don't fully appreciate the way that those traditions interweaved, and frankly, the way that the Muslim Brotherhood tradition was made much more radical and vile by Saudi influence before they became such famous enemies in the first decades of this century. So, like, yeah, just broadly speaking, it was the United States sponsorship of a really crappy monarchy that poured tens of billions of dollars over half a century into creating this whole vision of radical Islamic terrorism or what have you, that honestly was never very strong and never had very much independent weight. That as soon as MBS leaned back on the taps just a little bit, it evaporated.
Right.
It is not a real. It was largely a creation of U.S. and Saudi policy,
Right.
and we're all pretending. And I think it actually has really dissipated to a high degree. This absurd demonization of a billion people on this planet, rather than just do the barest investigation of what actually happened with 9/11, with Saudi Arabia, and with the Islamic State.
Yeah.
Like the Islamic State, the big, scary, nasty mess was basically the U.S. government got back in bed with the people who did 9/11. It's absurd.
In Syria, in that case, right?
In Syria, well, in Syria, but of course that obviously what happens in Syria did not stay in Syria,
Yeah,
as
for sure. Went to Iraq and other places.
or an Ariana Grande concert,
Oh,
or
yeah, for sure.
a promenade in Nice. That these are very real consequences,
Very
and
real, yeah, for sure.
and to this day, nobody. It's great that this sort of out there nuts version of Islamophobia is sort of fading away to the extent where when somebody drops it in my YouTube comments, I'm just like, oh, are you from 2015? That's adorable.
Yeah,
Uh, like it's nice that it's faded away, but there's been zero reckoning with, why 9/11 actually happened, why the Islamic State actually rose. And I don't expect there ever will be. But if you want to know about it, it's in my book.
Yes,
Everybody's
it's
thinking
in
about
this
Islam.
book. I can
Yes,
recommend. Everybody's
yes.
lying about Islam. Yeah, you made me think of two things. One of which I've already mentioned, Adam Curtis. There was already something like that mentioned in, I think it was called Bitter Lake. I don't know if
That
you
was a
know that
great one.
one. There he speaks about this kind of American Saudi uh, collaboration and then ties it to Afghanistan. I think it focuses more into Afghanistan. I'd like to get into
Yeah,
Afghanistan
that
in a
was
bit as
exactly what
well.
my question was going to be. Because Bitter Lake is mostly the BBC's archives from 15 years in Afghanistan, right?
Yeah,
And
but
then
he starts
then
it
he
off
frames
with
it, he
a
frames it with FDR, yeah.
yeah, yeah. He starts it off with like an exposition. He starts off with King Faisal, I think, and all these things, um, or even
Well,
before that.
I think Bitter Lake is where FDR met with Ibn Saud in
With
like
Ibn
19
Saud, yeah, yeah, yeah,
yeah,
yeah, right, right.
in the 40s.
Yeah,
Um,
and you helped me give more context to this as well. That it had already been a kind of family that was like collaborating with the Brits to an extent, if I got
oh
that
yeah,
right.
oh
And
yeah.
so in a sense, it had already been a kind of like similar to the Indian Raj, a kind of decentral colonial authority. And in what sense has that not changed? In what sense is the economy of Saudi Arabia as a state still functioning like a colonial state? Is it most of its import and export? I didn't look that up, unfortunately. Is most of its imports and exports still tied to the US?
Oh, well, no. So it depends on how you mean tied to the US. Even during the period when the United States was more dependent on foreign supply. I mean, we were getting more of our oil from Venezuela and Mexico and Canada, but we certainly had of explicit and growing interest after the oil crisis from Carter on in policing and controlling Saudi Arabia and the Middle East, largely because those oil resources were the main things going to our allies in Asia. Japan is tremendously reliant on Saudi oil, and I believe remains so to this day.
Hmm.
China is massively, massively reliant on Middle Eastern oil of all types. So it was never like quite that direct in terms of like the terms of trade of Saudi Arabia. But I don't think there's ever been any real question as to where the real power lies for Saudi Arabia in terms of who's the client state and who's the patron.
Can you
Um,
explain that relationship? How in what ways is does the US maintain its power over Saudi Arabia in specific?
Well, it's not like absolute monarchies are I mean, at a really baseline level, are a aberration in the 21st century and in the 20th century. It's just not something that really exists anymore. It's kind of absurd, and you can't really point to many examples. You can point to a few, but not many examples outside of the Persian Gulf, where you have what the British called the trucial states, which were the modern UAE, Qatar, Bahrain. I'm not sure if all of those fit under the trucial states moniker, but more or less, which are basically explicitly very tiny enclaves on the coast, maintained initially so that the British could sort of maintain control over that body of water, and then preserved under U.S. hegemony because they all had oil and gas resources. Like there, as we saw multiple times, there's really not much reason for these places to exist other than U.S. and British protection. We saw this in 1990. Iraq really thinks it should have Kuwait, and honestly, if you think about it, are they wrong? I mean, they're wrong. They're wrong in the context of post 1945. Borders are borders. That's a really cast iron principle that we should hold to. But it is pretty ridiculous that like this little tiny postage stamp of a country is lording it over all of these oil and gas resources that could be better served, whether it's for all the Arabs or just the 40 million Iraqi Arabs. So they've always sort of had a point there. So like these
Okay.
these the
Interesting. I
point
haven't heard that perspective. Yeah.
the point of these countries is to maintain really weak power over the oil resources that the West wants to exploit. Absolutely, in the 60s and 70s, certainly Saudi Arabia, and I believe at around the same time, or perhaps a little later, perhaps a little earlier, Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar did the same thing that most other oil and gas producers did, which was, some degree of nationalization, a refiguring of the relationships. I mean, if you look at certainly prior to the World Wars and for a decade or two after the World Wars, I can't remember, they called them the Seven Sisters or something like that. It was basically a collection of U.S. and I think perhaps Royal Dutch Shell was in there as well, and perhaps U.S. and European companies that just controlled all the oil in the entire world, and dictated terms to all the countries that happen to have those resources. In the 60s and 70s, all of that was renegotiated. And higher percentages were given to the local countries. In some of those places, the deals really were, much more favorable, and most of those places actually they were more favorable to the locals. More resources were sort of divvied up. So this was also the case in Saudi Arabia, but it is telling, of course, that the company is still Saudi Aramco, which is Arab American oil company. Aramco is the Arab
Ah,
American
okay, okay, okay.
oil company. And yes, the Saudis got a much bigger slice in the 60s or the 70s. It escapes me but it's still very much a hybrid American Arabian institution where there's a lot. I mean, now it's probably many fewer American engineers or what have you, but it's always been I guess, I think Saudi Aramco is still the largest company in the world. And
It's
it's
up
it's
there for sure.
it's always had sort of a quasi-governmental um, uh, quasi-international nature. And the way that power is interweaved between Aramco, the Saudi royal family, and various U.S. contractors, consultants, board members, this, that, and the other thing, has always been rather opaque, but I'd say more deeply interweaved than, say, the U.S. relationship with the Venezuelan oil company when it was functioning appropriately, or Pemex, the Mexican state oil company. Uh,
I want to interject with one question that is actually at the same time a title of a chapter in your book,
oh yeah.
namely, what about
What about the Petra Dollar? I've had long arguments and long discussions with financial professionals about this, and the financial professionals are just like, well, it's not nothing, Rob.
okay.
It's certainly not the magic bullet, the like, oh my God, if Saudi Arabia just decides to do something slightly different, American empire goes poof. Like that is not actually how anything works. You can make very strong argument, and I think there's some truth to this, that in the context of Nixon getting off the gold standard in 72, 73, something along those lines, which was I mean, a lot was happening in the early
Yeah, you had the
1970s.
Yom Kippur War, and
Mhm.
as far as Adam Curtis explained it in his documentary, that was what prompted King Faisal to put an embargo on the oil, which
Yes,
did
that's
seem to have on the surface real consequences in the sense that it did pressure or blackmail the US to act in a certain way. So you could argue that that was a case of power exertion in the other direction of Saudi on the US. However,
oh, I don't,
then if you go in the conspiratorial direction, he was assassinated 1 or 2 years later, and they haven't really done something of that scale since, have they?
well, I think the apocryphal story is that Kissinger, I don't know if he told Faisal or Faisal's successor, like you do that again, and there's no more Saudi Arabia,
Okay.
uh, which is something that would be an interesting dynamic that is sort of counter to the way a lot of people conceptualize American power during the Cold War versus the post-Cold War. Is that our military presence in the Middle East is almost entirely a post-Cold War thing. It was in the aftermath, U.S. government these wheels turned slowly in the aftermath of the oil crisis. They call it the Carter Doctrine, I think.
Hmm.
Basically, the United States started with the instantiation of CENTCOM, started and actually beginning in the 1980s with a war against Iran that we just sort of don't talk about.
The Iran-Iraq War.
No, a U.S. war against Iran that we just don't talk about.
Oh, okay.
Uh, yeah, it's basically we jumped into the Iran-Iraq war on Iraq's side heavily, sunk most of the Iranian navy. They call it the tanker war. If you want a quick Google, you can Google the tanker war. And the
Hmm.
more you read about the tanker war, you're like, Jesus Christ. Andrew Basovich, the head of the Quincy Institute, wrote an amazing book called The American War for the Greater Middle East that does a fantastic job. I basically did a video. I did a video about 2 years back that was essentially half of it was rehashing
I'm
Andrew
writing that
Basovich.
down. Yeah.
And he basically talks about like it's absurd that we start our discussions of U.S. involvement in the Middle East with the 1990 George H.W. Bush versus Saddam Hussein Persian Gulf War, because actually we were already putting a ton of resources in there, and we had actually fought a fairly big war that we don't like to talk about to defend Saddam Hussein.
As it goes.
And yeah. Actually, I got some pushback from this from knowledgeable people on my Discord server, but I mean, it looks to me, but there are smarter people than me on the Discord server, on my Discord server. It looks to me like pretty much the United States went in, tipped the scales in Iraq's favor, and that's the only reason that Iraq was able to take back territory that Iran had taken. This is after a war that Iraq started, most of a decade prior. The United States sort of tipped the scales and forced Iran to the negotiating table. I had a very knowledgeable guy in the Discord server said, no, 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 it was actually Saddam Hussein managed to do some, managed to push the Iranians back fair and square. I don't know if that was just Arab nationalism on his part, but it does seem to me significant that we sank Iran's navy and then they came to the negotiating table. But there is dispute on that
Room
on
for
that topic.
debate. I see.
Room for debate.
I see.
Um, but so what I'm saying is just that like the United States, when actually Saudi Arabia and the oil was much more important to our strategic picture of the world, we didn't actually have much military presence there.
Hmm.
Now we emphatically do. We've got at least 50,000 troops running around, 5 to 10 separate countries. It's just sort of more in keeping of my broader theme that what we've been seeing over the past 20 years is not, in fact, U.S. empire dissolution. It's U.S. empire consolidation.
Consolidation. Yeah, I've
But I should
read.
answer your
Yeah.
I should answer your petrodollar question. So in that context of the US getting off the gold standard, everybody just being like, wait, how does currency work now? We don't have any, we're completely at sea. I think that the Saudi choice to use its windfall from those dramatically heightened oil and gas prices, largely to invest in the United States and to use the dollar as the
Reserve
currency
currency.
of
Yeah.
account for those transactions was really important and absolutely helped to establish the U.S. dollar without the backing of gold. I mean, then there are periods of time when the U.S. dollar was not backed by gold, and it was fine before, but certainly in this context, that was very important. That is a real historical basis of the petrodollar. Would it be a real problem for the United States today if Saudi Arabia were to be like, nope, we're doing rubles or we're doing renminbi going forward? Yes, not as big a problem as it would be for the Saudis or the Chinese that aren't really, ready to have their currency, have made steps towards their currency sort of floating more freely, being used in more of an international fashion over the past decade. And every time they've tried it, they've been like, oh God, no, no, we are not ready for this. This is not something we want to handle, largely because as soon as money flows freely, Chinese rich people try to get as much money out of China as possible. So they're not,
Okay, I see.
they don't really want to do that. So yeah, would it be a problem for the US? Yes. Would it be a empire destabilizing end of everything? problem for the U.S.? I really don't think so. Um,
Hmm.
I don't think that works. And I mean, just to consider just how there's too many other factors. Were Saudi Arabia to take such a destabilizing step, the dollar might actually go up. I mean, that's sort of what we've seen.
Yeah.
The scarier things get, the stronger the dollar gets,
Yeah.
over and over
Yeah.
again.
That's
But
interesting. Yeah. Just sorry.
it's an open, sorry, just let me say it's an open question. Maybe it'd be terrible for the US. Maybe it would be a big challenge for the US. My sense is probably not. But I'm very confident that this idea that the petrodollar is a sort of get out of US empire free card, just change this one simple trick is nonsense.
Yeah. Fair enough. Fair point. And seems very plausible. Um, just I'm getting back to what you were saying earlier about propping up Saddam Hussein and then fighting him a few years later, and that just brings me into a general question because like there does seem to be some sort of clear sense which countries, which regimes, which figures are the good guys, which ones are the bad guys. But it is not always straightforward or clear what the criterion is, or whether there even is a consistent criterion. And we
Mhm.
are here all about figuring out, cutting to the meat and bones of power. Um, so why, for example, that this is obviously a long range, and you don't have to get into detail for all of them, but we have these like top three that I like to always bring up, and that is Gaddafi, Assad, and Saddam Hussein. All three of which at some point were likened with Adolf Hitler and had to be immediately removed. And in
Mhm.
all three cases, you have very, very destabilized. Well, actually, Assad hasn't been removed. I have to qualify.
Mhm.
But yeah, very, very destabilized regions, very, very broken, failed regions left. And it kind of. Oh,
I still hear you.
okay. Um, and for some reason, this is kind of it. It almost seems to me as an outsider like there's no resolution. It's just kind of okay. Iraq is wrecked now. That's it. Okay, Libya's wrecked now. That's it. It's like there's no closure. That's just kind of these were identified. There's more than them, but like these are the top three I like to mention: Gaddafi, Assad, Hussein. They were identified as bad guys. We destroyed them or their regime, or attempted it in the case of Assad, and then just kind of left it at it. And just on the face of it, in terms of their values, in terms of their dictatorialness, in terms of
Mhm.
their conservative values, or you could say oppressive values towards minorities and women, whatever, they don't necessarily represent regimes that are different in quality to a lot of the like Saudi rulers or a
Mhm.
lot of the Gulf states. So what is the real criterion? What is the real truth that they would have in common? What would be something without getting in too much detail because you could probably do 5 hours on each one of them. But what is the distinguishing quality that has declared them enemies?
Um, I mean, I guess this is the great gift that Israel gives to the United States. The main U.S. Approach is that we want, especially post Cold War, we desperately want enemies. We're desperately in seek of enemies because otherwise, if we can't find them, we're going to have to stop spending all this money on weapons. And Taiwan gives that to us. Ukraine recently has given that to us. But Israel's the old standby.
Yeah,
That's
yeah.
that's
I
that's
like how
been that's been
naturally we're getting through the topics, how I've listed them in my questions. We just naturally move on. That's pretty. So Israel will
huh.
be next, but yeah, continue. Sorry.
Yeah, well, no, but so that's sort of the Arab nationalism more broadly was infinitely more threatening to the United States than any worthless little monarchy. This is illustrated over and over again with Jordan, with the Gulf monarchies. It's just they're easy and weak and easy to push around. And it doesn't really matter that they talk a lot of smack about Israel because they spend most of their time doing things that we want. Sure, the Saudis were allowed to talk smack against Israel, and yeah, the king. That's a great point. I never really thought about that. The king that did actually create an oil crisis that was a fairly serious problem for the United States ended up assassinated, and no Saudi king tried that ever again. The I do think I wouldn't go. I think you can make a pretty good case that that assassination had nothing to do with the United States. But it is interesting, isn't it?
It is
Uh,
convenient, but
yeah.
I'm not gonna make a strong claim about that. It's
No,
just.
why I was thought I was on the cusp of making a strong claim about that, and I don't want to do that. And Yeah, so the Nasser was a real problem for us, despite the fact that we saved Nasser. And I think it was one of the greatest, smartest things we did was save Nasser in the
Suez
during the
crisis.
Suez crisis
Yeah.
in the 1950s. But then latterly, we became disenchanted with Nasser, and largely because he kept after Israel invaded. It's fascinating to me that when we talk about the big wars of the Middle East for Israel, we talk about 1948, we talk about 1967, we talk about 1973. We never talk about 1956 and the fact that Israel attacked Egypt and invaded and attempted to occupy much of Egypt out of nowhere. And I think occupied the Sinai for a decade or so. Did they occupy the Sinai from
Yeah. As far as I know, yeah, they did
Oh no,
occupy it.
sorry, no, the Sinai was from 67 until 79, not from 56,
Oh
because in 50
yeah. True.
the
73 was the
US,
attempt to reclaim it.
yeah, yeah, because 56, the US basically told the French, the British, and the Israelis they needed to go home or face the consequences, which I think one of the greatest, smartest moves made during the Cold War by the United States, frankly.
Well, didn't
Um,
technically Israel also invade first in 67?
I haven't like gone through the minutia. Yeah, it was preemptive, right?
Yeah, it was preemptive with after a mobilization of Egypt at the border of the territories that Israel had. Yeah.
I haven't studied I've always tried to avoid the topic, and one of the great sources of depression to me over the past 6 months is that it has been unavoidable.
So why
But
is Arab nationalism, for example, with you brought up Nasser, that'd probably be a good one on the list as well. You could
Mhm,
probably maybe bring in, well, that's not Arab, but you could bring in Iranian nationalism with Mossadegh
mhm.
in the 50s. But like more recently, like the three I mentioned, Gaddafi, Assad, Hussein, why would their flavor of Arab nationalism be dangerous to the US, or is it mainly dangerous to Israel?
It's a combination of a number of factors. It's oil. We want to control the oil. Gaddafi and Hussein both had a lot of control over oil, and that which both annoyed us because it's our oil, we think, and also it gave them resources to support all kinds of things that we to support. I mean, both though I think you can over the long stretch of Gaddafi's time in power, you can find periods of time when he was supporting Palestinians, and I'm sure the periods of time when he had, perhaps violent fights with the PLO. I mean, it's a long dude was in power for 60 years and he was a lunatic. Sorry, 50 years and he was a lunatic. Hussein also like has, interesting. Was it Arafat? Yeah, I guess Arafat refused to join the bandwagon against Saddam Hussein, if I recall correctly,
Mm-hmm.
because of the support for Palestine. So it's just any kind of independence, that degree of independence, to actually reflect what most Arabs want, which was opposition to Israel, is not something that we were prepared to accept. And I think that,
And is
yeah,
it
and I,
mainly due to the Palestinian issue, or does Israel represent a kind of, you could say, like an occupying power within the region? Like, I don't know. Are you familiar with the historical with the Pale in Ireland, the um, the region around Dublin, that at a certain time after after the conquerings of the at the time Norman dynasties
Mhm.
in England. The power kind of retreated and weakened over Ireland, and at some point there was only a strip around Dublin called the Pale.
Mhm.
That was basically kind of the colonial state within Ireland, from
Mhm.
which they exerted influence over the lordships in the rest of Ireland. The lordships retained some form of partial independence, but technically they were still part of the dominion of the lordship of Ireland. And that
Mhm.
strip, that little strip, represented kind of the colonial power. So I just read about it recently, and I was wondering, is it just due to sort of Palestinian solidarity, or is Israel seen as some kind of Middle Eastern pale, some kind of little strip that represents a colonial kind of hub that exerts its influence over the kind of semi-independent states in the Middle East?
I think that's probably the way that Joe Biden sees it, which is kind of amusing when you consider his history with Irish nationalism.
Yeah.
Yeah, the I think Joe Biden really, I mean, some of his just absurd statements, like if Israel didn't exist, we'd have to invent it. Like there really are a bunch of people who really believe that Israel serves some kind of purpose for U.S. politics in a positive sense. And it does. Israel serves a very, very real purpose
Yeah, I know what you're gonna
for
say. Yeah.
well, it's making a mess.
Yeah, yeah,
That's the point.
for military contractors
Yeah,
for
no, that's the point.
yeah.
Yeah, that's it's the exact, Taiwan and Ukraine are more attractive, but it's the same deal. And it's interesting. You have some I got very angry on a TikTok stream yesterday because there was just some guy preferring sort of brain dead anti-Semitic pronouncements about "Hey, Israel runs the U.S. government, brr," what have you. And I'm just like, nah, man. Like, okay, then explain Ukraine, explain Taiwan. Like, this is something that we do, and because there are a lot of committed, fanatically committed folks to the cause of Israel. And yeah, that there's a confluence of interests between those people and people who don't really care about Israel at all and just want to sell bombs.
But you,
But
you would say that there's a difference between Israel and the others, between Israel and Ukraine and Taiwan, in terms of the support at home, like in terms of what Mearsheimer spoke about with the lobby, or in terms of the more like even evangelical, like religious convergence within the Republicans in the United States, and things like that, and popular culture as
well,
well, Hollywood.
we've gotten better at it. I think like Israel was something that sort of dropped in our lap, and became so much more central to U.S. politics in the aftermath of the Cold War, because this was it. This was the violence we had. This was the stuff we were able to profit off of. Whereas what we've crafted in Taiwan and what we've crafted in Ukraine, there's much less ambiguity there. We've gotten smarter and better about it. There isn't a subject population. I mean, I'm sure some would argue that the people in Donetsk and Luhansk could prefer to be Russian or whatever, but meh. But we've been much smarter with these newer versions. It is interesting, that Biden comment. You look at it in that context. If Israel didn't exist, we'd have had to have invented it. And you know what? We invented it in Taiwan and Ukraine.
Well,
And
yeah, yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
because yeah, we're here to sell bombs.
So
And
you would say that this pale argument that I just made in comparison with Ireland, that is not necessarily true. It's not necessarily colonial outpost, or is there some truth to it, or do you think the majority or the major reason for Arab nations becoming a threat would be the Palestinian issue?
I think there are people in the US government who believe that pale argument, and that's, I would argue, a great failure of imagination on their parts. Because, in fact, if our interest was true control, broad sweep for US business, lack of agita, and US security, that's Israel, Taiwan, and Ukraine are all against that. None of those serve US security. None of those serve US control of anything. None of those serve US power.
Right.
Those exclusively serve
Yeah.
the assets selling
Yeah.
bombs.
I just
We
like
don't
the
have we don't have a Taiwan in Latin America. We don't have a Taiwan in Western Europe, and those are just ours.
Yeah, fair. I just like to
and so
qualify.
yeah.
I understand it from the American support side, the argument,
Yeah.
but
Mhm.
I'd be more asking as well about the Arab support for the opposite. Like where is that motivation coming from? Well, the Arab resistance, so to say, to Israel. Um,
Mhm.
I personally think that it has only recently, in some aspects, become religiously charged, but
Mhm.
I don't think it's religious essentially. And I'm just wondering, do you think is it mainly about the Palestinian issue? Is it mainly a kind of Arab solidarity with the Palestinians, or is there something else to it? Like I just made that pale argument. That would be an
Mhm.
argument if if they felt that that is the hub, the center of their kind of lack of independence, thus it needs to be destroyed for their independence. That'd be one thing. Do you think they believe in that kind of pale argument, that it represents a colonial hub, or do you think the Palestinian issue is the number one aspect? What do you think from the perspective of the Arab nations and from the perspective of them being a threat to Israel? What, from their perspective, makes Israel be their enemy, be seen
Well,
as their enemy?
acknowledging for a second the ridiculousness of a 44-year-old white man who hasn't lived in the region for 6 or 7 years, opining on, the hearts, dreams, feelings, and aspirations
Fair.
of the Arab peoples. My sense, from what I know about human beings, and what I know about a fair amount of deep reading about post-colonial struggles, is that like this is very clearly a symbol of Arab subjection and not a religious thing, but a just a deep like dignity of the Arab people. And like Israel it's a constant reminder that that sort of liberation, not just from Britain and France, because at this point the independence from Britain and France has lasted what, 4 times as long the period of subjection,
Right.
but from the Ottomans, from the Turks. It is it's not necessarily religiously based. It's a bunch of white folks who sort of came in and still control the place that is theirs, that they believe to be theirs. And I don't believe Israel's going anywhere. And I do believe that there were a million better roads to be taken by Israel vis-a-vis the Palestinians. Things that looked very possible in the 1990s. That frankly, the United States, more than Israel, has worked pretty heavily to stop. I see Netanyahu as pretty much a American plant working.
He's very American. Like he does go on a lot of American podcasts. He's kind of very familiar with the pop culture. He seems like a very kind of Americanized person, you know.
Yeah, and I mean he works for defense companies. The Likud party works for Lockheed Martin. The idea that these power relations go the other way is convenient for people who want to hide the ball, but is seems pretty flatly ridiculous to me. Just when you consider how bad the past 20 years have been for the long-term prospects of the Israeli project.
Right.
So,
In terms of now, I touched upon this aspect of like the religious charging of these conflicts because now a lot of people understand it, especially people who are not really into the topic, understand it as like a religious thing. A lot of people
mhm.
have come to believe that I've spoken to that there is some sort of eternal enmity between Islam and Judaism
But
and
yeah,
these kind of things, which
just
is
listening to podcasts, like people have been killing each other there for thousands of years. And I'm like, yeah, when the Europeans show up, you know, like, yeah,
or
during the Crusades 1,000 years ago. And then, the Ottomans killed a couple Mamluks and it was pretty peaceful for a half millennia, you know.
yeah, that's the thing. That's the thing. It's interesting how it flips where people, especially now from a more conservative angle, I like to also try and be post ideological and check out loads of different
Mhm.
views. I'm sure if I like tried, we'd end up debating about a lot of things. But I'm more interested now in finding out what you think about these aspects. For example, I hear this notion of Judeo-Christianity a lot from like a conservative or libertarian corner of the internet, and that
Mhm.
is something that I find that I kind of never really thought about, but then in the end find a bit confusing notion if I think about the long periods of time in which the Christian world had very severely oppressed the Jewish community in their countries and had very strict laws on them and considered them genuinely theologically antithetical, right? As in heretical, but not only heretical, but like specifically rejecting our Messiah and these kind of things. Whereas for a large chunk of history, that was not really the case in the Islamic world. The Jewish communities would tend to flee the areas that the Crusaders would capture and retreat into Muslim-dominated areas and things like that. I just find it interesting how this notion of Judeo-Christianity in opposition to Islam, in eternal opposition to Islam, has gotten so popular now. Have you ever thought about this? Have you ever? What do you make of this kind of this Judeo-Christian slogan, or is it actually way older than I think, and there's some merit to it?
Well, I think I don't think it's much older than you think, but it's maybe 200 years old. Undeniably, if you're talking about all of the history of Christianity up to 1800 or so, by far the more viciously anti-Jewish approaches are found in Europe, in Christian Europe. I think we can absolutely be oversold as Islamic tolerance. I think you have to understand that we're dealing with 1400 years of history here. There absolutely have been Islamic empires that have been virulently anti-Semitic. There have been
Persians as well, as far as I know, on some
yeah, I mean,
occasions.
yeah, and absolutely. But I'd say on balance, up until 1800, there's been a lot more. There's after 1800, and sort of with underpinnings of the Enlightenment or what have you, in European and US societies, there have been real currents, real intellectual traditions of the centuries provenance around actually people are just people, individual rights. Um,
Hmm.
always
I guess in
uh,
England and France, I suppose Germany took a bit longer.
always combated back and forth. Always, well, I mean, Germany. There wasn't a Germany before 1870.
Yeah,
There were
yeah.
German principalities, some of which were far ahead of England and France, some of which were far behind. This is all very complex and whatnot. Which is, it's just, I have a lot of difficulty going back. This is why I have zero interest, frankly, in Israeli or Arab claims about, well, the Canaanites and the the Philistines and the if you want to throw the Bible at me, uh, Quran at me to talk about people's rights to land in the Middle East, I'm simply just never going to listen to you again. I find it flatly ridiculous, and this is a very American approach. Like
I
I
mean, with
just
that
don't.
argument, you could just give it to the Turks or whatever, right?
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah, pretty much. They're the people who've, controlled it, the most. And I'm an American. I am living on Manhattan Island right now. I have some sympathy to the idea we conquered it, we took it, that sort of thing. With the understanding that things changed in 1945, and we are striving as a human community for a better approach to these sorts of
That is
things.
this right of conquest is kind of becoming outdated, in a sense.
Yes, well, that's well, it is the trick here is that it's actually saying that the right of conquest is outdated is kind of part of the U.S. hegemony, and we won, so
Yeah,
we want to freeze things at 1945. I'm completely on board with that project, frankly,
yeah. That is
and
what I find. Yeah,
the extent to which Israel is against that project is problematic for the United States.
but that's the
Um,
problem. The United States seems to be playing a double game to some extent because the United States does support a lot of these institutions that condemn Israel, that support Palestinians, and these kind of things. But the US seems to also very firmly support the Israeli state at the same time. That is at least my impression. And in that sense, I often see um, a mixing of two kinds of arguments. I just for the context of this, I'd call one of it like the idealist one, the more realist, without I don't necessarily mean the like academic definitions of these words, um, but you have kind of on the one side the more realist approach in the sense of, well, Israel is the dominant force, they have the stronger military, they conquered the land, uh, they should be in charge of how to manage its borders, how to respond to attacks, and all these kind of things, right? On the other hand, you have this idealist argument, though, in favor of the Israeli side, saying, well, they are the more moral army. The other side kills civilians on purpose. They kill them by accident, right? There's this idealist argument still creeping, like being sneaked in. And on the other side, you also have both in the sense. You have this realist argument in terms of, yes, it's not good to kill civilians and all that, but after being under blockade and oppression for so many years and having civilians killed all the time, it is just realistic that people will have enough and just resort to blind violence against their oppressor. And then, but there's also this idealist argument that because they're the oppressed and because there's such a thing as international law, this is not right. So it's like kind of these arguments get mixed around and thrown around on both sides, and that makes it difficult for me to find a coherent position on this, which is probably why there's no solution to it for so long, right? Because it's like if you try and be consistently realistic, I feel like I don't manage, or consistently idealistic, I feel like I could say, oh, I could just like kind of nominally say, oh yeah, it would be great if we had international law and if we had this and that and a two-state solution, blah blah. But then realistically speaking, how would that even take place? You know?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot there. I'm not sure what the question was, but the way that I see it is, you've got the hardcore foundation is that the United States loves the instability that Israel brings. On top of that, you've got a very real and committed and diverse group of people who are tremendously committed to the Israeli state, be they evangelicals, be they Zionists of any religion, be they um, folks who are still really angry about 9/11. That is a and have very misdirected anger about that. I guess that's a diminishing population, but it still exists. And then on top of that, you just got all manner of bullshit, like just the absurdity of watching dear friends of mine just prefer just the absolute rankest nonsense in the aftermath of October 7th on Instagram. Just like, oh, the Israelis are the true indigenous revolutionaries or whatever. And it's just like, oh my God, like it's just ahistorical hogwash advanced by people that I know to be very smart, but just don't actually know anything about Israel or the history of the
Well,
conflict
then
because they have I guess they have real jobs, so
yeah, well then let me clarify what my question was. Is
yeah.
you're right, I didn't really make it very clear, but like, what do you make of a moral argument at all? Is it useful at all? What do you make of the argument that one side has the more moral army, for example? Or what
Oh,
do you make
yeah.
of the argument that might makes right, there's no morality? Either of those sides.
From a moral standpoint, it's appalling because it's clear to me that the Israeli Defense Forces have gotten worse as they've gotten more secure. Israel has not been under any kind of real threat since 1989. Before 1989, they were under real threat, like, being surrounded by Israel and Jordan. They knocked off Egypt in the late 70s. But Israel, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, and the Soviets that were pretty strongly committed anti-Israel by the end of the Cold War. That was a real threat to Israel. But you have all these descriptions of not just Ronald Reagan, but George W. Bush, not George H.W. Bush, who's famously was probably the last seriously Israel critical president we had, or the last president who was willing to sort of order Israel about. But George W. Bush, sort of reacting when the Israeli Defense Forces killed like 10 Palestinians at once. telling them to shut it down and giving them all kinds of guff. It's fascinating to me and really quite horrifying that as Israel has become dramatically more secure, is now in a context where Saudi Arabia is de facto an ally of Israel. The Egyptian dictator is even shakier than Mubarak was, which means he's even more dependent on Israel than, the Jordan is basically a satellite state of Israel. And in this context, they've got to commit atrocities on this level. It's really, I mean, it's really profoundly disturbing. And yes, obviously, October 7th was a horrible attack, but it was a horrible attack that happened because Netanyahu doesn't know how to run a government or a military. I mean, this is extraordinary negligence on Netanyahu's part. He put most of the Israeli military into the West Bank to beat up the Palestinians that were trying to work with him and paid no attention to the Palestinians in Gaza who were openly saying, we want to exterminate you. The fact that Netanyahu hasn't been, ridden out of town on a rail by this point is shocking to me. Because October 7th was a legitimately horrific thing that happened to Israel because of Netanyahu. So yeah, most moral army. Yeah, anybody trying to sell that line of tripe to me after the past 6 months is not going to be dealt with very respectfully.
Well, thanks.
The
I did wanted to hear your insight on that, definitely. Just to stick to come back to that topic of religion and the role of religion. And I mentioned earlier as well that there seems to be also some sort of strange alliance with like American evangelicalism. I'm not really very familiar with that kind of
I think it's
religiosity.
oversold. I think it's oversold, frankly.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, yes, there are absolutely a lot of and unfortunately, there's these yahoos are represented in Congress, a bunch of people with a particularly fallen and crappy interpretation of Christianity, that are obsessed with weird conspiracy theories about, how to get the right number of Jews back, and then we're going to build a temple, and we're going to sacrifice all the
Yeah, do
Jews.
you know the thing about the red heifer and the temple and all that?
As little as I possibly can. I know as little as I possibly can about that.
Okay.
And certainly, and that's what I'm talking about. You've got this base layer of we love having Israel to bomb stuff, and then you've got this diverse group of people who are really dedicated to the idea of Israel. And yes, like those evangelicals, because of the idiosyncrasies of U.S. electoral politics, you can get some representatives who just Israel's all that matters to me because my anti-Semitic preacher tells me to. You can have those people in Congress or what have you, but I think as a general reason why the U.S. is so supportive of Israel, I think that's kind of a smokescreen. I think it is one faction among many, but I think people sort of default to that a lot, mostly because it makes the United States look stupid.
I would say
Which
though that especially among young people and among academics and the sort, some media outlets, you do have in the West, maybe not as much in Germany, maybe not as much in the UK, but you do have also a larger movement critical of Israel's and more in support of Palestine. You do have larger protests in these countries. Um, I do kind of see that as well. Like I felt like some of the more like left or liberal media in America is definitely more in support of Palestine, or at least more critical and or more balanced. I did have that impression. Um, I do. That'd be my kind of disagreement with people that comment the kind of things that you mentioned earlier. That I don't see it so monolithic when coming from the U.S. Um, or do you think that's just irrelevant noise? That's just
No, I think it's very relevant. I think Netanyahu has really broken that. This goes back to 2015 when he decided to come to the U.S. Congress and lecture the U.S. president. That was a big moment for me. I was never much of an Obama supporter. And that was a big moment for me. Like, who the fuck does this guy think he is? Coming in and trying to preach to us.
when was that?
Hmm?
When was that?
That was 2015. So like that is, I think,
2015. Okay.
yeah. That was a big moment because at that point I was in, I guess I was in Istanbul for, I think there was a big 2014 Gaza flare-up, right? So I was getting a little more unfiltered information about that, and I was like, this little penny ante butcher that we fund entirely is going to come into our house and try and tell us what to do. Leaving aside my feelings about Obama at that point, I was disgusted.
Mm.
I think to the extent that I became more Israel critical
Mm-hmm.
uh, over the extent of yeah, I think I did my first like, hey, Israel does not run foreign policy. This is what's actually going on here video,
Yeah.
probably a year or two after.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah,
I.
so
I.
there was a much more monolithic U.S. approach to Israel that is absolutely breaking down. I
Okay.
think the reason that Netanyahu is still in power at this point is probably because a lot of the Israeli establishment may realize that this is as much genociding as they're going to be able to do after Biden. After Biden's out of office, even with Trump, Biden or Trump, for the next 4 years, they'll probably be able to get away with a lot. But I think any younger politician that's going to end up as president is probably going to be. There's no question I think a lot of people are getting on the pro-Palestine side are getting way too hopeful. I think no matter who you're going to have in power in the United States, the two-state solution is going to be a forever distant thing that
Like the
we're never
rainbow,
getting
you go
closer to.
closer and goes further away.
Exactly. And I don't think there's any question in my lifetime, or really anybody else's of the US like being like in a position where they'd be like, oh, cool. Iran and Turkey can stamp out Israel. Sounds fine. Like that, I don't think that's gonna, I have trouble imagining that in any context. But maybe that's just the limits of my imagination. But I do think it's possible that the Israeli political establishment realizes that this is as far as they're going to be able to go on Gaza until the breakdown of U.S. empire or a larger regional war. I mean, this is why Israel's pushing so hard for a larger regional war right now, is because that'll allow them to kill more people in Gaza or force more people into Egypt or whatever.
Right.
So I do think probably there's an unacknowledged sense among Israeli leadership that if they're going to be taking Gazan territory and forcing Gazans out, they need to do it now because the worm is kind of turning. Not to the extent that anybody's ever going to be anti-Israel or anything like that. It's just that the U.S. tolerance for this level of slaughter is diminishing, I think.
Yeah, I think it's also a generational thing. I did make the experience that the boomers are like the more firm supporters, and my generation is a bit more critical. I
Mhm.
think it's a generational thing. I'd like to move to another thing before you've got to go and all that. That interests me, and that is something that I've only read in your book, and I do think of myself as someone that reads a lot. Namely, you made that question between, is conservatism always, or in Islam always, equal to Wahhabism? I think I sent you an email about this as well once. That it actually reminded me of something I haven't read anywhere. The only other person I've heard it from is my mother. Namely, uh, going to the last point I wanted to talk about, Afghanistan, and my background being partially from there. Um, she um, she mentioned to me, because I was talking about this whole like burqa and traditional garment and clothing for women in Afghanistan. And she mentioned to me that it was actually the more modern women from the countryside that would wear the burqa, that would wear the full covering, because the very modern women in the city would be
Mhm.
already kind of modernized or partially westernized. Would either in her days not wear any headscarf, not wear any hijab or anything, or just a light one. And the ones in the countryside would be working. They'd be busy at home or working on the farm. Essentially, like urban, rural areas in Afghanistan are still very, very like traditional, very, very old school. So the full covering would be like modern women, so to say, from the countryside, going to the city, because they have a countryside tradition, and in the city you'd be surrounded by a lot of stranger men, right? By a lot of men that are you're not related to and all that. And it was actually kind of a sign of a modern woman from the countryside rather than a traditional woman from the countryside wearing um, this burqa. And
Mhm.
the only time I've read or heard something similar was, which is a bit of a not a direct comparison or the direct similarity, is what you wrote about conservatism in Islam being a sign of development, or being a sign of a form of development in a society. And that is what I thought was interesting. And do you have anything more to elaborate on that, beyond what you've
Well,
written in your book?
you see that in the U.S. and Europe as well. The first flush of industrial wealth, or um, uh, broader spread of wealth. There's a lot of arguments about at what point did everybody start getting richer under industrialization. But in the 19th century, when a broader class of people were able to make choices about their lives, the tenor of public life became vastly more religious. The Victorian era in Britain, the 19th century in the United States with its serial religious awakenings. It was about like, well, we've got money now, so we can actually afford a certain level of propriety, a certain level of respectability. We can afford to have our women be a little more cloistered. We can afford these things. And aspirations changed over time, generationally. But it's not surprising to see the Islamic world, in a first flush of development, want to get much more conservative. That was in Saudi Arabia. It's Karen House, is that her name? Is a very sort of establishment scholar of Saudi Arabia. Talks about how when she first started visiting Saudi Arabia in the 60s and 70s, there was a much broader diverse approach to things. Yes, obviously, there weren't women running around in miniskirts the way there famously were in Tehran, but in private parties, there would be a much broader range of what women were allowed to wear, and how people approach things. And it was really only with the torrents of wealth that all of that was sort of shut down and became a little more um, limited and concrete. I mean, that's a very sort of established dynamic, and I don't think that it should be as surprising to people as it has been.
Right, right. Yeah, that's a good point. That's an interesting point. And yeah, you like I said, the only time I heard a similar point was when my mother explained me this phenomenon in the countryside of Afghanistan.
Well, and that's important because I think a lot of the circa 2015 Islamophobia was like, you've got all these new opportunities. Why are you acting in this crazy religious way? And it's because, yeah, that's exactly what all the European and American populations did when they first had access to wealth on a large scale.
That really highlights the importance of having like an education in history, and just understanding history, and having because it gives you a deeper understanding of human nature in a sense as well, and human development in a sense. And it also ties into, or it also gives you a good basis to argue against this, what you mentioned earlier, this what was it, Sam Harris, and what was the other one you mentioned, Bill Maher. This
Oh yeah.
where like the argument that they were making was basically conservative Islam. It's like a spectrum from conservative Islam to terrorism, right? It's like you
Mhm.
have moderate Muslims, you have conservative Muslims, you have very conservative, and then you've got the terrorists, right?
Mhm.
And yeah, that is, I think, how do you say? I don't know what that kind of characterization is necessarily like helpful for. Like it's I feel it mainly just kind of muddies the water and these kind of things, and muddies the water, especially towards some sort of actual solution to conflicts, solution to relationships, to Islamic countries, Islamic cultures, in that sense. Um, just one thing I'd like to touch upon in about Afghanistan is what I always found so frustrating is that is by far, for obvious reasons, the country I spent most time studying and studying the wars and studying the background of all these things. And I have to say, it's the more I've read about it, the less I actually understand what the war, at least the last one from the last 20 years, what it was actually about. The less I understand it, the more I study about it, the less I actually understand it. I see it seems almost like I've read less about like Iraq and the other things, but I kind of get it more than when it comes to Afghanistan because no single explanation makes an is like seems like a sufficient reason for me or like makes enough sense to me. The like women's rights thing doesn't is not a sufficient reason for that kind of war and occupation. The opium trade, I guess, is more plausible, but I don't know if you couldn't sort that in a more like handier way. The opium trade.
Well, Sean, does it all get a little more intelligible when you consider that the United States just likes fighting wars? That
That is one, but that seems really depressing. I mean,
That's
this
that's at the core of my analysis of the U.S. government is that, the Iraq War wasn't really about anything other than a war for war.
and
And
Afghanistan is just an easy target.
duration, the incredible duration. I mean, there was the first 6 months of the Afghan war, made some sense. But the 20-year duration is just because it was a gravy train. It was a way for the U.S. to make money.
So, would you say that um, the opium trade aspect is a secondary phenomenon? It
Oh yeah,
it contributed neither this or the other way.
it's something to do. Yeah,
Something to do. It's like
yeah.
a side income.
One of the greatest anecdotes I've ever heard is a family friend. He talked about uh, interviewing some Reagan administration guy about the drug war. And it's like, wouldn't it be, I can't remember what the exact minutiae was. It's like, wouldn't it be fairly straightforward to sort of stop most of this stuff at the border through some like basic custom stuff? He's like, yeah, but you got to give the cops something to do, you know?
Hmm. Hmm.
And yeah, it's yeah, the drug war was something to do. Women's rights was something to do. It was just an excuse to keep the gravy train
What
going.
about
Uh,
the harboring of Osama bin Laden?
yeah, we didn't like that. Clearly, it wasn't really our priority. We were threw a rock in the mix because we realized it would be a harder nut to crack, and there'd be more bombs to be uh, sold.
To close the
Uh,
loop to the very beginning of our conversation, what did you back then when you supported the war? What did you back then believe um, that you thought it was necessary to attack Iraq?
Blood.
But
I
but
wanted.
like but like, well, did you believe Iraq was behind 9/11?
Oh God, no, no. I just wanted blood and destruction. I thought Arabs did this to us, so we needed to show them.
Just
And
show
Saddam
any
Hussein,
Arabs.
yeah, absolutely. And Saddam Hussein was stupid enough to be in opposition to us. I wanted to steamroll somebody, and he seemed like someone to steamroll. And I think there's a lot of absolutely. The Bush administration lied about weapons of mass destruction. They all, should be in jail for that or what have you.
But did they
But I think
claim they were selling them to Al Qaeda? What was the actual justification?
the actual justification was weapons of mass destruction. The Al Qaeda 9/11 connection was certainly something that was made by certain unscrupulous journalists that have been magnificently rewarded for it. Jeffrey Goldberg now gets to run The Atlantic, which is one of the more prestigious institutions. He's a guy who was really pushing that myth. But no, the main justification was not because even for the Bush White House, they realized that connection was kind of impossible to make. The big thing was, well, we're worried about terrorism and there are Saddam Hussein very different flavors of terrorists, but in those years the nuances weren't important. Saddam Hussein um, did harbor certain Palestinian like Arab nationalist terrorists who were probably communists or what have you. But
Yeah.
that distinction wasn't, didn't matter enough because he was going for weapons of mass destruction, which was sort of like a famous lie. And I think what most people who claim they supported the Iraq War for a good reason were that, well, the Bush administration lied to us. This was a totally legitimate concern, the weapons for mass destruction that was, absolute nonsense. But I was never particularly, I mean, sure, he's got weapons of mass destruction, whatever. My instinct as a 22-year-old was I wanted to show those Arabs, I wanted to
Okay.
punish. I
Okay.
wanted to, I wanted blood. And I think that was probably a deeper rationale behind most support for those wars than we like to admit.
Yeah. Yeah.
And actually, I think, as opposed as I am to what Israel's doing in Gaza right now, when I look at the incredible support from the Israeli public for what the Israeli government is doing in Gaza right now, I get it. Like I understand. Like I did that. That was me.
Okay.
That was me 20 years ago. I just want blood. And I think it would be nice if because it wasn't just me, a lot of other people saying, yeah, I remember this. This is 9/11. This is exactly how we were acting. This is exactly how we were talking. And we regret it. And it's an incredible missed opportunity. And it was insane. And we wish we could have just been bigger, better human beings. And please, Israel, do this. And not, but it's not surprising that they've chosen not to.
Well,
Uh,
considering I'm a bit younger than you, and I like my first encounter with political topics around the age you're speaking of would be the rise of Trump, basically. Um, I did actually, and I think a lot of people that I knew, especially also people that had some like foreign background or even Muslim background, they did hope for a U.S. nationalism, protectionism, whatever that Trump was preaching to mean a kind of uh, republicanism away from the neocon trope,
hmm.
from the neoconservatism. Obviously, I get that this was a bit of a false hope, though. On the other hand, at least no new wars started during Trump. Um,
I
but
think well, I'm not a big fan of the no new wars started under Trump. I think he's set up every conflict that Biden has fallen into, and he also dramatically stepped up all.
Ukraine, I see the point with Ukraine definitely, since I've uh, informed myself more about that and the whole Soleimani thing in Iran and Iraq. Of course, I
And the Iran
understand.
nuclear deal. Like none of this would
Yeah,
be an issue at all if the Iran nuclear deal hadn't been ripped up.
yeah, for
Uh,
sure, for sure. But I mean, did you, was there any merit to that hope in the
yeah, no,
beginning?
I remember telling cute girl in a cafe in Istanbul, I desperately want Hillary Clinton to win, and but Donald Trump would probably be better in Syria, and he was. He basically ended large-scale U.S. support for jihadists in Syria. We still maintain the Idlib pocket or what have you. But he was weak, and he didn't do what he said he'd do. He said a lot of great things. He announced to great international fervor uh, the withdrawal of U.S. troops from Syria on three separate
And
occasions.
Afghanistan.
And none of that ever happened
Yeah, Afghanistan
because he was,
happened. Ended up like it started with Trump, but ended up happening under Biden's watch, right?
yeah, because he was a clown, because he was utterly incapable of executing what he said. If were he to become president again, there's all kinds of talk about, oh, he's going to do better this time. He's actually going to have people, and no, he's going to hire the same round of schmucks. Probably a different, he's not going to hire John Bolton
I was gonna say John
again.
Bolton. Yeah,
But he'll hire a different version of John Bolton because he's not very smart and he doesn't actually understand how any of this works. So yeah, so I think that was an understandable thing. He talked the absolutely thrilling clip of him in the 2015 Republican debate saying like what did we spend all this money for? Trillions of dollars for what? We didn't even win anything. It's just stupid. It's absolutely right.
yeah, I remember
Um,
that.
Utterly incapable of executing on anything he said.
Yeah,
Which is why um, even though I think Genocide Joe is the appropriate name for Joe Biden, I would still um, I'd still support him over Donald Trump for president.
what I found
Uh,
interesting as well was this Muslim travel ban I think you mentioned that in your book. I'm not sure that it kind of addressed none of the actual countries that were tied to terrorism, right? It was
Yep.
just some
Just,
some random places.
just a bunch of poor countries. Yeah.
Yeah. Some okay, maybe not completely random, but kind of random places.
Yeah.
Right. At least they were Muslim to some extent, but um, yeah, that was interesting. Yeah, I yeah, I suppose we can wrap this up. I really enjoyed this conversation. I liked the flow, how it naturally just kind of went along the lines of the questions I'd written down. Sometimes I
Mhm.
like wanted to go back on something to get more info and all that, but that really is often a sign of a good interview or good conversation if it naturally just leads to the next question, and you naturally bring up the next the next point. Um, yeah, I really enjoyed that. I'd really like to maybe if we get to do another conversation sometime. Do perhaps, if that's of any interest to you, a deeper dive into Afghanistan, especially because I have a lot of stuff read about it and a lot of personal
Mhm.
information from people I know, people. Um, so that there could be a lot of things brought to the table, maybe that can keep up or match your expertise
Yeah,
in the fields.
maybe we'll do that as a podcast. I haven't covered enough Afghanistan, frankly. That'd be good. And do you have a sense of how things have been going since the U.S. withdrawal? I think that'd be something I'd be most interested to hear more about.
Yeah, that is an interesting thing to talk about, especially because I get to at a relative's house get to check out TV. We get the
Hmm.
national television from there, and I think in a lot of ways it's a double-edged sword, and I really trying to, because I'm still getting used to the amount of like criticism you get when you expose your views online, which is
Hmm.
considerably less in my other videos that are just about philosophical topics.
Yeah.
I think the
Hmm.
most attacks I got with through my videos with you actually,
Oh yeah.
from both sides, from regardless of what side. So I'm going to carefully say it is a mixed bag. It is a double-edged sword in the sense that yes, a lot of the criticisms you'll see now about the new regime in the Western media are true. It is
Mhm.
correct. A lot of the stuff they say is right. Justified criticism and all that. On another hand, I have heard on many occasions from many different sources that it is like the first time in 50 years you have anything resembling stability and law and order, which is kind of the bedrock on which you can that you
Build
even
anything. Build
anything.
anything.
Yeah,
I went to Vietnam, was there just a couple weeks back, and it's just fascinating how watching their museums evolve from like the Museum of American Atrocity to the War Remnants Museum, and just like watching the way that like certain historical places like the Hanoi Hilton, where a bunch of U.S. soldiers were held, are sort of like becoming this like site of reconciliation between the U.S. and Vietnam, and a
yeah,
lot of this has to do with Vietnam's deep hatred of China. But it is just fascinating how for 20 horrific years, the United States sponsored the destruction of Vietnam. And it literally took about 15 years after we just finally stopped for Vietnam to invite the United States in. I got McDonald's in Hanoi. What was the whole point of that war anyway?
right.
I think that just that with that bedrock of stability, you know what, there were awful things about the Vietnamese regime in the couple of years after they'd established that bedrock of stability, putting much of the population of the South into re-education camps, terrible things. I'm sure there were some reprisals, what have you. The Taliban definitely doing that sort of thing. But 5 years from now, 10 years from now, 20 years from now, it's probably going to be an American tourists going to Kabul.
Yeah, we'll
So
see about that.
indeed, indeed. But yeah, I'd love to talk about that further at some point. But at this point, I gotta get going.
Yeah, thank you very much, Robert, for coming on my stream. I really appreciate it. Really enjoyed the conversation. I advise everyone to check out your podcast, your channel, your books, obviously, this one among
Mhm.
others. I think next up on my list should be Avoiding British Empire. I haven't read that
Yes,
one yet.
the doorstep, but I think it's well worth reading. I think it's well
Yeah, I
worth reading.
think partially why I got through this one first was because it was short and quick to read. I
Indeed.
think I got it in an afternoon or two.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah,
but
more straightforward.
yeah, ever more reason to read it because it's actually pretty good for people as well that are not like geopolitics expert and just are taken to know what you're talking about everything. You do explain things well. So yeah. Anyways, enjoy. Looking forward for our next conversation, and thanks for coming on, Robert. Speak to you next time.
All right, thanks a lot.